Hello and welcome to the BBC's News at 1 o'clock. The serial killer Harold Shipman has been found dead in his cell at Wakefield Prison. The former doctor was discovered by prison officers hanging from strips of bedding just after 6 o'clock this morning. Attempts to resuscitate him failed. Shipman was jailed for life for murdering 15 women patients at his practice in Hyde in Greater Manchester. A public inquiry later decided that he'd killed at least 215 of his patients with morphine injections. The prison service says Shipman was not on suicide watch and an investigation has been ordered. James Westhead reports.
Just after 11 o'clock, Harold Shipman's body leaves Wakefield Prison near Leeds. It was here in the early hours of the morning that Britain's worst mass murderer apparently took his own life, hanging himself with bedsheets from the window bars of his cell. He may have been its most infamous inmate, but he was treated as a normal prisoner on an ordinary wing. Like the other Category A prisoners, he was locked up at 8 o'clock last night and should have been checked every hour. But at 6:20 this morning, he was found hanged. Efforts were made to resuscitate him, but he was declared dead at 8:10 this morning.
My understanding is that he was being watched every hour as a Category A prisoner. This is the normal routine procedures. I understand that some movement was heard in his cell at 6 o'clock this morning, and of course he was found dead at 6:20 this morning.
This is the kind of cell Shipman had been kept in. Although he had been on a suicide watch at previous prisons, at Wakefield he was not. The prison service insists in a statement there was absolutely nothing in his behaviour to indicate he was likely to attempt suicide. His behaviour was consistent and gave no cause for concern.
On the particular wing that Harold Shipman was on, there's 28 Category A's and 160 prisoners and one member of staff to check them. I'm sure you can understand that that is the way that we check them. That is a reasonable way of checking them, and in the main it works very well at Wakefield.
It would have been Harold Shipman's 58th birthday tomorrow. The former GP thought responsible for more than 200 murders. Elderly patients from his practices in Hyde and Todmorden, he deliberately gave deadly overdoses of diamorphine. At the Shipman family home this morning, his son was emphatic. They had nothing to say.
Made today. Go home.
But reaction from elsewhere is starting to come in. Some pleased a notorious killer is dead. Those furious he's escaped justice in this life. James Westhead, BBC News.
Our correspondent Catherine Mutton is outside Wakefield Prison now. Catherine, are there any further details about what exactly happened this morning?
Well, the prisoners issued just a very brief statement outlining the details, as we've heard, that Harold Shipman's body was found at 6:20 this morning, that attempts to resuscitate him failed, and then he was pronounced dead at 8:10. But the Prison Officers Association say that Harold Shipman was checked every hour through the night, as is standard procedure for a Category A prisoner, and that they can confirm he was still alive at 5 o'clock this morning. Harold Shipman's body has been taken from Wakefield Prison, we understand, to a medical centre in Sheffield. There will now, of course, be a post-mortem examination carried out. There is an assumption here that this is suicide, but a post-mortem examination must establish the cause of death. And, of course, there is also the police investigation, which is currently ongoing, into exactly what happened.
Catherine, thank you. An investigation into Harold Shipman's death will be carried out by the new prisons ombudsman, Stephen Shaw. He will investigate why Shipman was not on suicide watch. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Daniel Sanford.
A serial killer notorious throughout the world, Harold Shipman was unique because of the number of people he killed, at least 200, and also because he preyed on older women. The victims who hadn't been cremated were exhumed in the summer of 1998, when the full horror of what the local GP had done became clear. From then, he was destined to spend the rest of his life in prison, a sentence he has now escaped. Although Harold Shipman was one of Britain's most infamous prisoners, he was being held on a normal wing in a cell on his own. He'd been on a standard privileges regime. Before Christmas, he had those privileges reduced to basic because he'd been difficult with staff. He had his TV removed and he had to wear uniform instead of normal clothes. But he'd recently had standard privileges restored. Although he had been for a short time after his arrest and again after his conviction, Harold Shipman wasn't on suicide watch. All the same, he was checked every hour or so during the night. If he'd been on suicide watch, he'd have been checked every 10 minutes. 9 years ago, another serial killer, Fred West, managed to commit suicide in prison even before his trial. Last year, Ian Huntley almost managed to kill himself with a drug overdose. On both occasions, the prison service was heavily criticised.
If somebody is determined to take their own life, it doesn't really matter what the prison service do. At some point in some day, they've got to be given 2 or 3 minutes alone to do what they have to do, and if that's the moment that they choose to take their life, they'll take it.
But keeping life-sentence prisoners alive is part of the prison service's job, one that's being made harder by the high number of inmates.
Well, 10 years ago we had about 50,000 prisoners, now we've got 74. Suicides are going through the roof. There clearly aren't enough staff in Wakefield or any other jail to stop all suicides happening.
Harold Shipman never confessed to what he did in his surgery and at the homes of his patients. Now he'll never explain his actions. An inquiry by the prison's ombudsman will concentrate on why Shipman wasn't classified as high risk for suicide and how the service lost yet another high-profile inmate. Daniel Sandford, BBC News.
Our correspondent Andy Ties at the Home Office. Andy, tell us a bit more about what kind of investigation this is going to be.
Well, Anna, Steve Thor, as we've been hearing, is the prison ombudsman, and that means traditionally he looks into complaints by prisoners about their treatment within jail. Now, from April this year, he's due to take on the further responsibility, which he's been pressing for, to examine and to look into prison suicide. So effectively his start date for that's been brought forward. And in the past, he's said that he's happy to look at the broader issues surrounding any particular prison death. So perhaps that gives us some kind of an indication of the sort of inquiry that we might be looking at here.
And do you think MPs will leave it up to the prison authorities to investigate?
Well, that's certainly been the case so far today. Of course, it could be seen as very embarrassing that so soon after Ian Huntley tried to kill himself before his trial, that Shipman should manage to take his own life. And of course, this is in the context of a pretty high level of prison suicides. 94 people were able to take their own lives in prisons in England and Wales last year.
Andy, thank you. Well, Harold Shipman worked as a GP in Hyde in Greater Manchester for 20 years, and the majority of his victims came from there. Our correspondent Kevin Bouquet is in Hyde now. Kevin.
Anna, there are plenty of people here in Hyde who believe that Harold Shipman should have been hanged in the first place, and today I guess those people got their wish. But there are others who feel cheated, and not least the relatives of some of his victims, because they believe there is so much that Harold Shipman could have told them. How many people did he really kill? And above all, why did he kill them? Clustered around the centre of Hyde, rows of mill cottages. Every street was touched by Shipman's crimes. This is where the victims lived, where the relatives still mourn. Shipman's surgery is closed now. At least 5 of his victims died here. Among them, Bertha Moss, seen here with her grandson. Her family feel cheated because Shipman went to his grave without ever admitting his guilt.
For example, we don't know about my dad. I think he'd done too many for remember to say, oh yeah, by the way, I did your dad as well. It obviously puts us through an awful lot of anguish. It would have been better had we had some answers. I don't really think we would have ever got the answers, but knowing that he was still alive and there was a chance, you know, it gave us some solace.
The cemetery where so many of Shipman's victims were buried. Some people in Hyde say prison was too good for him, that he should have hanged anyway.
We've been keeping him in prison for what he's done, so I was very pleased what happened.
He's cheated the relatives again, obviously, because the main thing they'd want to know is why he did this to people for no reason, apparently.
I mean, we knew people personally and that, and they're still talking about it now and that. And I thought he would have come clean and told the truth, really.
Now it will be up to the Shipman inquiry, already in its 3rd year, to provide any remaining answers. Harold Shipman's secrets died with him early today in a prison cell in Wakefield. Well, Dame Janet Smith, who is chairing that inquiry, concluded that Shipman killed 215 of his patients, and that now is the best estimate we're ever going to get, because today Harold Shipman claimed one last victim, himself. Anna.
Kevin, thank you. Now today's other main stories. For the first